Our next speaker has a job that not many of us have ever heard of. He's a forensic structural engineer. While many people, including lots of therapists in the room, investigates the secrets that people are hiding, he investigates the secrets that buildings are hiding. Here to show us what he looks for when he's looking for secrets, please welcome Lynn Morse Fortier.
First of all, let me apologize for not having any really wonderful story, but what I do is unusual, and David thought it might amuse some of you to learn a little bit more about it. For those of you who know this already, wood expands and contracts when it interacts with moisture. So if you grew up, as I did, in an old house in New England somewhere, the doors would stick in the summer and rattle in the winter. And that has manifestations in a lot of different places, but one of the ones that is always jarring to me is to see people make corners that look like that, because when the boards shrink, they shrink more across than they do up and down. So every season the angle changes. And in this case it's winter, and so the gap is on the inside. I guess that's not going to show. And in the summer the gap would be on the outside. I once met an elderly woman who had filled that gap with about a ½ inch of goop because she complained that every summer a crack developed on the outside. She caulked it and filled it. And the next winter, it was back on the inside again. So she caulked that and filled that, and the next summer, it was back on the outside again. So she was slowly jacking the corners of her window open. This is a sad story because the people who own this house have tons of money, which isn't the sad part. The sad part is that they let someone look after their summer home in the winter, and the humidifier failed. And so this cherry wood surround, which I guess you can see. I can't even imagine how many hours it took to make that, but if those of you who know Scott Kyle's here, he could probably tell you it's not a few. And what happened was when the house dried out, because the humidifier failed, that happened. So the board wanted to shrink sideways, and what you can't see very well are that there are little dowels that hide screws. And unfortunately, this doesn't really give me a pointer that shows up on the screen. But when you have a piece of wood that wants to get shorter and you stick things in it so it can't, it'll split. In this case, it split in a number of different places. And as you imagine, they were not very pleased. And so that board will have to be replaced. The irony, of course, is that the next summer when the wood regained some of that moisture, those cracks would close, but they wouldn't really disappear. And the wood had, in fact, been ruined. So here's an example of secrets and lies. This is a house where folks bought a house that already existed, had been in its location for 20 or 30 years, but it was near the ocean, and they bought it at the end of the summer, and no one had lived in it all summer, so it was pretty warm and humid that summer, as it is in New England any summer, and near the ocean more so. So all the wood in the house had taken on a lot of the moisture that was in the atmosphere. So when the new folks came in and renovated the house, they added some engineered lumber. So to the right of this picture is a piece of engineered lumber, and to the left is the piece of normal lumber. The normal lumber has shrunk, as you can see, enough so that some electrical wires go through, but also my pencil actually fits through. Well, it turned out that this framing member was meant to replace a wall. And so on either side of where that wall used to be, on the second floor, was one side of the bedroom door and the other side of the bedroom door. So when the floor shrunk, the sides of the bedroom door dropped, but the board that was new, that didn't shrink, created a hump. So when they opened their bedroom door, it dragged on the floor. I don't know how many of you have some problem like that in your house. We actually have a little bit of it in ours. So when it dragged on the floor, that was one problem. There were some cracks in the drywall finishes in places, and it was the winter of 2015 when we had a lot of snow on the roof. And so these folks said, well, this must be from the snow on the roof. So they called their insurance company, and the insurance company sent some people out. They said, we don't really see the weight of ice and snow as the issue because, among other things, you've already cleared all the snow off the roof. Snow's gone, and yet your house is still misbehaving. So we think it's probably not that. Well, they were insistent because, of course, you're insured for things that are caused by the weight of ice and snow, but you're not really insured for things that are caused by nature. And so, notwithstanding the work I did to prove, I thought, convincingly that this was all about wood moisture, these folks insisted that no, it was from the weight of ice and snow. They called my work fantastical, and in their eyes, at least, I am perhaps the biggest liar in this room. This is a familiar sight perhaps to some of you as well. This is a house where the pine floorboards were very wide. And as can happen sometimes, people convert their home from oil heat to gas heat, but they don't bother, even if they remove the oil tank from the basement, they don't bother removing the pipes that are sticking out into the driveway that used to be used to fill the oil tank. Well, that's fine unless you share your driveway with a neighbor who still burns oil, and the guy who delivers the oil to the neighbor gets confused about which house to go to. So this is a house where they filled the basement with oil. Essentially, the gentleman backed his truck in the yard. He dumped all the oil that was in the truck into the basement and wondered why the tank wasn't full. Looked through the basement window and saw where all his oil was. So the EPA had to come and clean it all up and everything else, and then they put a new concrete basement floor in. Well, the next spring, they called me and said, the gaps between the boards in our floor are bigger than they've ever been. And it's got to be from the oil spill in the basement. And it was. But there are a lot of dots that had to be drawn and connected before I could make the path from the oil in the basement to the gaps between the boards. So I'll share that with you. That turns out that wood moisture content lags the seasons just as the heat lags the seasons. June 21st, longest day of the year, official beginning day of summer, never the hottest day. We get our heat in August and maybe even sometimes into early September. Well, the same is true as wood absorbs moisture. So wood probably reaches its maximum moisture content sometime in October or so. And then it starts to dry out when the heat comes on in your house in the winter. Well, in this case, when did the oil get spilled in the basement? Well, it got spilled in the fall when they came to deliver oil. So late October, they filled the basement with oil. A few weeks later, they get the whole mess cleaned up, but it's getting colder and colder. So the house is closed up. The wood moisture content in the house is more or less at its maximum because it's still not that far into the winter. So now they come, they clean up the basement, and what do? They fill the basement now with concrete. And as you know, when concrete arrives, it's very wet. And it does two things as it cures. It generates a lot of heat, but it also gives off a tremendous amount of moisture. And so all the wood in the house got an extra dose of moisture just at a time of year when it would normally start to dry out. So these wide pine boards, which obviously expand and contract every year and have done for the 200 years that this house had been in place, they had squeezed up against each other about as much as they could. And then the moisture from the concrete kicked in. The boards wanted to get bigger, but they really couldn't because they were already up against their neighbors. And they're pine. Pine's a fairly soft wood. So the wood fiber right at the edge of those boards got crushed a little bit. And so once the wood is crushed, even when it dries out, it's not going to uncrush. And so come spring, as the winter weather comes on and the house dries out, the boards get narrower, and because they are a little bit crushed at the edges, they're now narrower than they ever were. So the gaps are bigger than they ever were, and it's because someone filled their basement with oil. So that's welcome to my world. So I have to share one other thing that's a lie on me. I always tell people, let's go back to that first picture, that you don't usually see mitered corners in elegant old homes because the carpenters who built those kind of understood that that's what would happen. And I thought about that as I came into the church building tonight, and I would normally tell people, you should not expect to see big, wide trim with mitered corners. But if you look around this church building, it's filled with them. And none of them have any problem. So I have no idea why that is exactly, but it's possible that they're back primed. That is to say, if they're painted all the way around, it's not so easy to absorb and give off moisture. But I submit to you that in general, they're going to look like that in the winter, and in the summer, that crack will be on the outside. But shame on me for overgeneralizing. And look around the building, and you'll see a lot of mitered corners that are behaving just fine. And if you find one that isn't, let me know so I can save some dignity. Thank you.